The Ashford Winter Ball was the crown jewel of the London season. 500 candles blazing in crystal chandeliers, silk gowns sweeping marble floors, the cream of English society arranged in all their practiced magnificence. It was the sort of evening that made ordinary people feel small, and made those already small feel invisible entirely. Miss Eleanor Voss had long since made peace with the invisible. She stood near the arched windows at the far edge of the ballroom, her ivory gloves folded neatly in her hands, her dance card entirely, conspicuously blank. Around her, every woman had a partner. Every woman had someone whose arm she could claim, whose attention she could solicit, whose presence announced to the room that she was wanted. Eleanor had no one. She had known it would be this way. She always knew. 7 seasons had taught her the particular mathematics of her own situation. A modest income, an unremarkable face, no powerful family connections, no title, no fortune, and the unfortunate habit of saying precisely what she thought at precisely the wrong moment. Society had rendered its verdict years ago, and Eleanor had quietly accepted it. She was not bitter. She was not broken. She was simply alone, which was, she had decided, an entirely different thing. What she had not anticipated, what no one in that glittering room had anticipated, was him. The Duke of Ravenscroft entered the Ashford ballroom at precisely 9:30, and the crowd parted before him the way water parts before stone. He was tall, dark-haired, broad-shouldered, dressed in immaculate black evening clothes that seemed to absorb the candlelight rather than reflect it. His face was all sharp angles and cold authority, the face of a man who had commanded armies in another life, who had buried losses too large for ordinary grief, who had long ago decided that the world owed him nothing and that he, in turn, owed the world nothing back. Society called him the Frost Duke. Not to his face, of course. Never to his face. He had not attended a ball in 3 years. His name was Adrian Ashcroft, the 8th Duke of Ravenscroft, and as he stood in the entrance of the Ashford ballroom with his grey eyes sweeping the assembled company, Eleanor felt a peculiar certainty settle over her, the novelist's instinct, the observer's reflex, that something was about to happen. She was right. His gaze moved across the room, past the diamonds and the debutantes, past the matrons with their marriage-minded daughters, past the young men lounging with affected boredom, crossed the floor, climbed the wall, and found the arched windows. Found her. Eleanor did not look away. She was too surprised to look away. And in the 3 seconds before he began to move, she catalogued the expression on his face with the precision of someone who spent her days studying human nature and committing it to paper. He looked, she thought, like a man who had made a decision. He crossed the ballroom floor directly toward her. Every conversation faltered. Every head turned. 500 people held their collective breath as the Duke of Ravenscroft, cold, reclusive, formidable, walked past every eligible woman in the room and stopped before the one standing entirely alone. He did not bow from a distance. He did not offer a polite nod. He stopped, looked down at her with those fathomless gray eyes, and said, in a voice low enough that only she could hear it clearly, "You are the only honest person in this room, Miss Voss. Dance with me." Eleanor stared at him. Around them, 500 people stared at her. She should have said no. Every sensible instinct she possessed told her to say no. But something in his voice, some quality of exhaustion, of genuine asking, beneath the aristocratic command, made her reach out and place her hand in his. "You know my name," she said quietly. "I made it my business to know your name," he replied. And then, before she could ask what on earth that meant, he led her onto the dance floor, and the music began again, and Eleanor Voss, the woman with the blank dance card, the woman no one wanted, danced with the most powerful duke in England while 500 people forgot to breathe. To understand what that moment meant, you must first understand what it cost. Eleanor Voss was the daughter of a country vicar, a good man, a learned man, a man who had given his daughter the finest education his modest income could provide and the unfortunate gift of a mind that refused to be satisfied with half-truths. Her father had died 4 years ago, leaving her a small annuity and the growing suspicion that the world was not arranged with her particular comfort in mind. She had come to London at the insistence of her mother's cousin, a well-meaning baroness who believed that 7 seasons of failure were merely a run of bad luck and that the 8th would surely be different. Eleanor did not believe this. Eleanor attended the balls and the musicales and the afternoon calls because she had nowhere else to be, and because London offered her the circulating libraries and the bookshops and the quiet corners from which she could observe the great theater of society with the detached appreciation of someone who intended to write about it someday. She was 26 years old. In the arithmetic of the season that made her an antique. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense. Her features were too strong for that, her eyes too direct, her mouth too quick to offer the wrong opinion at the wrong moment. But there was something about her that lingered in the memory, a quality of presence beneath the surface of her quiet manner, as though the real Eleanor Voss was simply waiting for someone perceptive enough to look past the wallflower exterior and find the woman beneath. No one had ever looked. Until now. Adrian Ashcroft, the Duke of Ravenscroft, had not intended to attend the Ashford ball. He had not intended to attend any ball, for any reason, at any point in the foreseeable future. He had returned to London only because his solicitors had insisted that certain estate matters required his personal attention, and he had agreed only because the alternative was another winter alone at Ravenscroft Hall, surrounded by portraits of ancestors who had all managed to produce heirs and looking at the empty rooms where his own family should have been. He was 34. He had been a widower for 4 years. His wife, Cecilia, had died in childbed. The child, too, a son who had lived only hours. Adrian had loved Cecilia with the fierce, protective devotion of a man who had not expected to love anyone, and her death had dismantled something essential in him. Not broken by him, precisely. He was too stubborn to be broken, but emptied him of the things that made a house into a home, a title into a life, a man into someone who could walk into a ballroom without feeling the weight of every absence. Society said he was cold. Society was wrong. He was not cold. He was careful. There was a profound difference that most people lacked the patience to perceive. He had come to the Ashford ball on a whim, or what passed for a whim in a man of his temperament, which was really a decision he had made 3 days earlier but refused to examine too closely. He had noticed Miss Voss at a musical 6 months prior. He had noticed her again at an afternoon call, and again at the opera, always in the same position. Slightly apart, slightly overlooked, watching everything with those dark, quietly intelligent eyes. He had made inquiries. He had learned her situation, her history, her circumstances. He had found himself thinking about her at odd moments, not with desire, not then, but with a recognition that unsettled him. She reminded him of himself. Not the Duke, not the title, not the armor of cold authority that he wore like a second skin, but the person beneath it all. The man who sat alone in the library at Ravenscroft Hall long after midnight because the rooms were too quiet and sleep refused to come. He had told himself it meant nothing. He had told himself he was simply being fanciful. And then he had walked into the Ashford ballroom, and he had seen her standing at the window with her blank dance card and her quietly composed expression and her complete and utter aloneness, and something in his chest had shifted like tectonic plates. He had thought, enough of this. And he had crossed the room. They danced in silence for the first several measures. Eleanor was acutely aware that half the ballroom was still watching them, and she kept her chin level and her expression composed by sheer force of will, because she was absolutely certain that if she allowed herself to think too carefully about what was happening, she would do something unforgivable like trip over her own feet. The Duke danced impeccably. Of course he did. "You are not going to ask me why," he said finally. It was not quite a question. "I had considered it," Eleanor replied. "I decided to wait until I could formulate the question properly." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile exactly, not yet, but the suggestion of one like a word on the tip of the tongue. "And have you formulated it?" "I have several versions. The polite version asks whether you are well acquainted with my family. The practical version asks whether you have lost a wager. The honest version. Give me the honest version." She looked up at him steadily. "The honest version asks why the Duke of Ravenscroft, who has not attended a ball in 3 years and who could have danced with any woman in this room, has chosen to dance with the one woman everyone else has collectively decided does not exist." The non-smile deepened infinitesimally. "Because," he said, "the one woman everyone else has collectively decided does not exist is the only one who appears to be paying attention." Eleanor considered this. Paying attention to what? Everything. The music swelled and turned, and he guided her through the movement with a sureness that required no words. She felt the warmth of his hand through her glove, the steadiness of his arm beneath hers, and she told herself firmly that she was not moved by any of this, that she was simply processing data as she always did, that she would write about this evening later with calm analytical precision. She was already failing at this plan. "You know who I am," she said after another silence. "You said you made it your business." "Yes. That is either very flattering or very alarming, and I cannot decide which." "Perhaps both," he said, and this time there was no mistaking the humor beneath it. Quick and dry and entirely unexpected from a man whose reputation was carved from winter stone. "Miss Voss, will you walk with me when the dance concludes? The portrait gallery is cool and considerably less crowded than this room." Eleanor's every instinct for self-preservation rose up in chorus. Unchaperoned. Irregular. Absolutely not. "Yes," she said. "I believe I will." The portrait gallery was exactly as he had described it. Cool and dim and hushed, lit by a scattering of oil lamps that threw warm light across the painted faces of long-dead Ashfords. Distantly, the orchestra continued. Eleanor could hear the murmur of 500 conversations resuming now that the spectacle had concluded. She wondered what they were saying about her. She decided she did not particularly care, which was either a sign of great wisdom or complete recklessness, and she could not at this precise moment determine which. "You right," the Duke said. He was standing before a large portrait of some bewigged ancestor, but his attention was entirely on her. Eleanor went very still. "I beg your pardon? At the Pemberton musical in October, you had no music to follow. You spent the entire recital with your hand moving slightly against your skirt, tracing letters. You were composing something." She stared at him. "You were watching me. I told you. I pay attention. That is—" She stopped herself before she could say unsettling, because it was unsettling, and also oddly, inexplicably moving, in a way she did not want to examine too closely. "I keep a journal," she said carefully. "You do more than that." She looked at him for a long moment, calculating. He met her gaze without flinching, without the polite discomfort most people displayed when Eleanor looked at them too directly. He simply looked back, steady and patient and entirely at ease with silence. She exhaled. "I write novels," she said, "under a gentleman's name. I have published 4. The Duke was quiet for a moment. Then, "The Vain Inheritance series." Eleanor's heart stopped. "I beg your pardon?" "Gothic romance. The widow who inherits a Scottish estate and discovers her husband's first family. A man named Voss on the title page." He tilted his head slightly. "My late wife enjoyed them greatly. I read 2 of them after she died, to feel closer to something she had loved." The portrait gallery was very quiet. "I am sorry," Eleanor said softly, "for your loss." He said nothing for a moment. Then, with the careful precision of a man who had not spoken of this in a very long time, "She would have liked you, I think. She had no patience for pretense." "Nor do I." "No." His gray eyes held hers. "I have noticed." They stood there in the dim gallery, 2 people who had built their lives around the art of not being seen, regarding each other across all the careful distance they had each constructed, and Eleanor felt something happen in her chest that she recognized immediately, despite every effort to prevent it. She was in a great deal of trouble. He called the following morning. This was irregular. This was, by every social convention Eleanor had spent 7 seasons learning, extraordinarily irregular. Dukes did not call on obscure country vicars' daughters the morning after a ball. Dukes certainly did not arrive at precisely 11 o'clock with a volume of poetry tucked under their arm and the expression of a man who has done something impulsive and refuses to apologize for it. Lady Grantham, Eleanor's benefactress, received him with barely concealed delight and the strategic wisdom to find a pressing errand in another part of the house. "You left before the announcement," the Duke said, when they were seated in the morning room with a tea tray between them and 12 inches of entirely inadequate propriety separating them. "What announcement?" Lady Ashford read out the dance pairings for the evening's cotillion. "Your name was not on the list." "My name is rarely on such lists. It will be from now on." Eleanor set down her teacup carefully. Your Grace. I appreciate. Adrian. He said it quietly, but with the absolute authority of a man unaccustomed to asking twice. We are not going to be formal with each other, Miss Voss. I find I have no patience for it. Eleanor, she said after a pause, and I find I have no patience for inexplicable kindnesses from powerful men with unclear motives. He looked at her steadily. The motive is entirely clear. I wish to get to know you better. Why? The question hung in the morning air between them. He did not answer immediately, and she respected him for that, for taking the question seriously rather than deflecting with flattery. Because, he said finally, I have spent 4 years in a room with all the doors locked, and I have recently begun to suspect that is not, in fact, survival. It is merely a slower way of disappearing. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. That, she said quietly, is the most honest thing anyone has said to me in 7 seasons. His mouth curved. A real one this time, small and unguarded. You are very easy to be honest with. It is alarming. So I have been told. He called again 2 days later, and the day after that, twice the following week. Society noticed, because society always noticed, and the whispers that began in drawing rooms and at morning calls were a mixture of astonishment, speculation, and the peculiar cruelty that fashionable people direct at those they cannot categorize. The Frost Duke and the Wallflower. It made no sense. It had to be a wager, a jest, some elaborate aristocratic caprice that would end with Miss Voss more humiliated than she had begun. Eleanor heard the whispers and chose to ignore them, because ignoring things was a skill she had refined over 7 seasons into something approaching artistry. What she could not ignore was him. He brought her books, not fashionable novels, but the things he actually read, histories and natural philosophy, and the occasional slim volume of verse with pages marked and margins annotated in his careful hand. She read them and returned them with her own annotations, and the conversations that followed were unlike any she had ever had. Genuine and challenging and entirely devoid of the social performance she found so exhausting. He took her to see his orchids. This sounds like a small thing, and she supposed it was. The Duke of Ravenscroft maintained an extensive conservatory at his London townhouse, and on a Tuesday afternoon in early December, he brought her there on the pretext of showing her a botanical specimen mentioned in a book they had argued about, and she watched his hands move among the flowers, those large, aristocratic, commanding hands, with a gentleness that rearranged something fundamental in her understanding of who he was. You love them, she said, watching him adjust the support of a pale lavender bloom with careful fingers. They are reliable, he said, not looking up. They respond to what they are given. Good soil, adequate light, appropriate temperature. They do not pretend. Unlike people. Unlike most people. He looked up then, and the afternoon light through the glass caught the gray of his eyes and made them, for just a moment, something other than guarded. You do not pretend. I have never been very good at it. No, you are not. Something moved across his face, swift and deliberate as a decision being made. Eleanor, I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it properly, not as flattery, because I am not in the habit of flattery. She went still. I am not easy to know, he said carefully. I am aware of this. I have been told it frequently and with considerable feeling by people who had legitimate cause to know. I can be cold. I can be withdrawn. When things become difficult, my instinct is to lock the doors rather than admit anyone who might see the difficulty. I want you to understand that before. He stopped himself. Before what? She asked softly. He looked at her. Before I ask whether you might consider allowing me to court you in earnest. The conservatory was very warm. Outside, December London went about its business. Eleanor's heart was doing something entirely beyond her control. I have conditions, she said. Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, and behind it, the first real light she had seen in those gray eyes. I would expect nothing less. I will not give up my writing. My name on the title page. My independence of thought. I would not ask you to. I will tell you when you are being wrong. I suspect this will happen with some regularity. I have no doubt. And I will not fall in love with you simply because you are a duke and you have been kind to me. If it happens, she paused, steadying herself, it will be because you have earned it, properly, without shortcuts. Adrian looked at her for a long moment, and there was something in his face that she had not seen before. Something raw and real and entirely unguarded, like a window opened for the first time after a long winter. Eleanor, he said quietly, I would not have it any other way. She took his arm as they walked back through the conservatory. Their shoulders were close. She could feel the warmth of him even through their layers of wool and propriety. She told herself, firmly and without much conviction, that she was managing this entirely reasonably. She was not managing it reasonably at all. He attended the Bancroft dinner and sat beside her and argued with her about the Reform Act while Lady Bancroft looked on in bewildered delight. He sent her a first edition of a natural history text she had mentioned wanting, with a note that said only, I found this. I thought you should have it. She sent back a chapter of her current manuscript with a note that said, Tell me honestly if it is terrible. He replied the next morning with 3 pages of detailed, perceptive criticism and the final line. It is not remotely terrible. It is quite extraordinary. Do not stop. She did not stop. He took her riding in Hyde Park at the unfashionable hour of 7 in the morning, before society was awake, and they cantered along the Serpentine in the pale winter light, and he told her about his boyhood at Ravenscroft Hall, the wide moors, the library with its smell of old leather, the way his father had expected so much and said so little that the space between expectation and affection had grown into something impenetrable. She told him about her father, the sermons written at the kitchen table, the long walks through the Suffolk countryside, the evenings reading aloud, the particular loneliness of losing the only person who had ever truly seen her. He would have had opinions about you, she said, watching a pair of swans on the pale water. Favorable ones, I hope. He was suspicious of powerful men who kept their feelings hidden. She glanced at him sideways. He was also very good at seeing past the surface to what was real. So I imagine it would have gone well for you in the end. Adrian said nothing, but his hand, resting on the pommel of his saddle, shifted slightly toward her. It was a small thing. It was also everything. His aunt, Lady Morrow, a sharp-eyed woman of 70 who had survived 4 monarchs and 3 wars and could reduce a cabinet minister to stammering with a single look, met Eleanor at an afternoon call in the 2nd week of December and said, within 30 seconds of introduction, So you are the one who has finally cracked him open. I wondered if it would ever happen. Sit down and tell me everything about yourself. Leave nothing out. I am old and I have no patience for the abbreviated version. Eleanor sat down. She left nothing out. Lady Morrow listened without interrupting, which Eleanor suspected was not her habit, and then said, You are not what I expected. What did you expect? Someone softer, someone more easily managed, someone who would smile and nod and decorate his life without troubling his interior arrangements. Lady Morrow's eyes were very sharp and very kind. Adrian does not need someone soft. He has spent 4 years building the most formidable walls I have ever seen on a living person, and what he needs, what he has always needed, is someone willing to simply refuse to accept them. He is showing me, Eleanor said carefully. What is behind them? Yes. The old woman studied her. And you? What are you showing him? Eleanor thought of her blank dance card. She thought of 7 seasons of invisibility. She thought of the way she had stood at the Ashford Ball window and looked out at the candlelit room and felt the particular ache of wanting something she had entirely stopped believing she was allowed to have. I am showing him, she said quietly, that being seen is not the same as being destroyed. Lady Morrow reached out and took her hand. Good girl, she said simply. Now, do not let him convince himself he is unworthy of you. He will try. He always does. That night, Eleanor could not sleep. She lay in her small bedroom at Lady Grantham's townhouse and stared at the ceiling and examined her own heart with the same unflinching honesty she brought to everything else, and found it exactly as she had suspected and entirely as alarming as she had feared. She was in love with the Duke of Ravenscroft. She was in love with a man who had told her he found it difficult to love. A man who carried 4 years of grief like stones in his pockets. A man whose walls she had been carefully, painstakingly helping to dismantle, and who now, she thought, was helping her dismantle her own. The walls she had built around her own heart, the ones that said invisible, unremarkable, not worth wanting, had been going down, brick by brick, every time he looked at her like she mattered, every time he asked for the honest version, every time he annotated her manuscript margins with careful, perceptive praise, as though her words were worth treating seriously. She pressed her hands to her face in the dark and tried to decide if this was wonderful or terrifying. It was, she concluded, both. It was Lady Whitmore who did it. Lady Whitmore was the sort of woman who had been beautiful once, and powerful always, and who had redirected the energy of her intelligence into the precise art of social destruction because it was the only arena in which she was permitted to be ruthless. She did not like inexplicable things. She did not like women who disrupted the established arithmetic of the season. And she particularly did not like the suggestion that Eleanor Voss, nobody, nothing, the vicar's daughter with the blank dance card, might have secured the most eligible duke in England simply by standing near a window at the right moment. She arranged a morning call. She arranged it very carefully. Eleanor arrived at Lady Whitmore's drawing room to find 12 of the most influential women in London already assembled, and she understood immediately that she had walked into something. She kept her chin level and took the offered seat and accepted the tea and reminded herself that she had survived 7 seasons of invisibility, and she could certainly survive this. Lady Whitmore smiled at her sweetly. "We were just discussing the most extraordinary rumor, Miss Voss. Some people have been so foolish as to suggest that Ravenscroft intends to make an offer. Surely you have not encouraged that impression." "His Grace's intentions are his own business," Eleanor said calmly. "Yes, but your encouragement is yours. And it does seem rather—" Lady Whitmore paused delicately, looking around the room for the audience's appreciation of what was coming. "Ambitious, given your circumstances. We all understand that a woman in your position must make the most of any opportunity, however fleeting, however clearly motivated by His Grace's eccentric whims rather than any genuine." "Lady Whitmore." The voice came from the doorway. Every woman in the room turned. Adrian Ashcroft, the Duke of Ravenscroft, stood in the entrance of Lady Whitmore's drawing room with an expression on his face that made 3 separate women set down their teacups with audible clicks. He had not been announced. He had, apparently, simply walked in. Dukes could do that. His gray eyes moved to Eleanor first, just for a moment, checking, assessing, and then settled on Lady Whitmore with the temperature of an Arctic winter. "Your Grace," Lady Whitmore said, recovering her composure with impressive speed. "We did not expect—" "No," he said quietly. "I imagine you did not." He crossed the room to Eleanor's chair and offered his hand, and his voice, when he spoke again, was perfectly controlled and entirely devastating in its precision. "Miss Voss, forgive the interruption. I had hoped to find you here." Eleanor took his hand and rose, because every instinct she possessed said to trust him in this moment, and she had learned in the past weeks that her instincts about this man were largely reliable. He turned back to Lady Whitmore. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Miss Voss is under my protection. I would be grateful if that were understood, not as a matter of courtesy, but as a matter of fact by everyone in this room." He let the silence sit for a moment, heavy and absolute. "I trust we will not need to revisit the subject." No one said a word. He led Eleanor out of Lady Whitmore's drawing room and down the stairs and onto the street, and she walked beside him in complete silence until they had turned the corner and were out of sight of the house, and then she stopped walking and faced him. He was looking at her carefully, the way he always did, reading her the way she was accustomed to reading other people. "You are angry," he said. "I am not angry, Eleanor." "I am—" She stopped, pressed her lips together, started again. "I do not need rescuing, Adrian. I am quite capable of managing Lady Whitmore." "I know. I have been managing Lady Whitmore's equivalent for 7 seasons without assistance." "I know that too." "Then why?" "Because," he said, and something in his voice had changed, stripped of its control, stripped of all the careful aristocratic composure, down to something raw and simple and entirely real. "Because I could not stand there and let her diminish you. I could not. Do not ask me to explain it more precisely than that. Eleanor looked at him. The street around them was quiet. A December wind moved through the bare-branched trees. You frightened me, she said softly. He blinked. I frightened you? When you walked in. For a moment I was afraid you would confirm what she was saying, that it was whims, that it was caprice, that it was... She stopped herself because she was very close to saying things she had not decided to say yet. Eleanor. His voice was very quiet. Look at me. She looked at him. I have not been whimsical about this, he said. I have been terrified. There is a difference. Terrified of what? He was silent for a moment, and she watched the internal battle on his face. The instinct to lock the doors warring with something stronger, something that had been building for weeks. Of caring for someone, he said at last. Of wanting something. Of standing at the edge again and not being certain whether I will fly or fall. His jaw tightened. Cecilia was. She was everything good in my life, and when I lost her, I decided that was my lesson. That love was the thing that broke you. That the only safe course was to want nothing. And now, he looked at her steadily. Now I find that the policy has a significant flaw. What flaw? It did not account for you. The wind moved between them. Eleanor's heart was doing the thing it had been doing for 3 weeks. The unreasonable, inconvenient, magnificent thing, and she chose, in that December street, to stop pretending she could manage it. Adrian, she said, I am also terrified. He looked at her, and she saw something shift in his expression. Relief, perhaps, at not being alone in it. 7 seasons, she continued. 7 seasons of standing at the edge of rooms and deciding that invisible was safer. That wanting things made you vulnerable. That the sensible thing was to expect nothing and be pleasantly surprised by the nothing you received. She looked at him steadily. You have made that policy rather difficult to maintain. Good, he said softly and fiercely. I am glad. She did not answer. He did not look away. They stood there in the December street with all the unsaid things arranged between them like furniture in a room they had not yet learned to inhabit together. Then his hand found hers, and his fingers wrapped around hers, warm and certain, and something very old and very tired in Eleanor Voss finally, quietly put down its armor. The letter arrived 3 days later. It came from a man named Lord Denton, an old acquaintance of Adrian's, a man who had known Cecilia, who moved in the same circles and had watched the past week's developments with growing displeasure. His motivations were murky. Some mixture of old loyalty, proprietary jealousy, and the particular bitterness of a man who had convinced himself that another's happiness was somehow an affront to his own. Eleanor never saw the letter. She only saw its effects. Adrian withdrew. Not dramatically, not cruelly. In the specific, devastating way of a man who had spent 4 years perfecting the art of quiet disappearance. Canceling engagements with courteous notes, sending books instead of himself, being present in proximity and entirely absent in every way that mattered. Eleanor waited 3 days. Then she called at Ravenscroft House. The butler admitted her to the library, and Adrian came in 5 minutes later with the careful expression of a man who has decided something and is managing the consequences of that decision. Eleanor, he said, I did not expect. No, she said. I imagine you hoped I would accept the notes politely and allow you to disappear. I have decided not to do that. He said nothing. He moved to the window, which she had come to understand was his retreat, the physical enactment of the impulse to withdraw. Adrian. She kept her voice gentle and her spine straight. What happened? Nothing happened. I have simply been. Do not tell me you have been busy. The silence was long. Denton wrote to me, he said finally, still facing the window. And he suggested, he stopped. He made a case for the ways in which the way in which you, another stop. He said that I was being sentimental, that I was repeating a mistake, that the wisest course, Eleanor said quietly. According to a man who does not know either of us and has an obvious interest in remaining miserable. He turned from the window. Eleanor. No. Listen to me. Her voice was very steady. You told me you were terrified. So am I. You told me you were afraid of standing at the edge and not knowing whether you would fly or fall. So am I. Every morning for the past 3 weeks I have woken up and told myself to be sensible, to remember what I am, to not want things I am not entitled to want. You are entitled. Let me finish. She held his gaze. I have told myself all of those things, and then I have seen you, and every single one of them has been proved a lie. Because when you look at me, Adrian, you do not see the woman everyone else sees. You see me, the actual person, the one who writes novels and has opinions and is sometimes sharper than she should be and doesn't know how to make herself smaller for other people's comfort. He was very still. And now, she said, because one vindictive man wrote you a letter, you are going to do what you have always done. You are going to close the doors. You are going to decide that the walls were right all along. You are going to make yourself safe by making yourself alone. She paused. I am asking you not to do that. Eleanor, if this... His voice broke slightly, and she saw him fight to recover it. If I allow myself to love you, and something happens, something might happen, she said simply. Yes, people die. People leave. The world is not arranged for our comfort, and it never has been. But Adrian... She crossed the room toward him, slowly, giving him time to step back if he needed to. He did not step back. Loss is not proof that love is wrong. The loss is the proof that what you had was real. And real things... She stopped before him, close enough to see his face clearly in the winter light. Real things are worth the cost. He looked at her for a very long moment. I destroyed the letter, he said quietly. The morning it arrived. I destroyed it and I tried to go back to. But you could not. No. Because you have already. Yes. Came out rough and low, dragged up from somewhere he had kept locked for 4 years. Yes, Eleanor. God help me, yes. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, the way she had wanted to for weeks. The simplest possible gesture, warm and present and entirely irrevocably honest. Then stop running, she said softly. I am standing right here. His hand came up and covered hers. He pressed his eyes closed for a moment, and she felt the shudder move through him. Not weakness, she thought, but the particular relief of a man who has been holding a very heavy thing for a very long time and has finally been allowed to set it down. I love you, he said. His voice was rough and quiet and entirely certain. I love you, Eleanor. I love your honesty and your stubbornness and the way you see past everything I have built and refuse to pretend it is sufficient. I love that you argued about the Reform Act at Lady Bancroft's dinner. I love that you annotate the margins of your own novels. I love that you were standing at that window at the Ashford ball, alone and composed and utterly yourself, and you looked at me when I walked toward you like you had already decided to be brave. Eleanor's eyes were very bright. You see, she said, I had not actually decided. I was simply too surprised to retreat. The sound he made was half laugh, half something broken and finally, mercifully, beginning to mend. Eleanor Voss, he said. Will you? Yes, she said. Whatever you are about to ask. Yes. He kissed her then, properly for the first time, in the winter light of the library with 14,000 books bearing witness. And it was nothing like she had imagined and everything she had needed. And when she finally pulled back and looked up at him, his gray eyes were warm in a way she suspected they had not been in 4 long years. You were supposed to let me ask properly, he said. You were taking too long, she replied. He kissed her again, which she felt was the only reasonable response. The engagement was announced the following week, in the Times, in the society pages, in the particular electrified whisper network that connected every drawing room in Mayfair before the ink was dry. The reaction was everything Eleanor had anticipated and then some. Astonishment, speculation, the careful recalibration of 100 social calculations as people who had dismissed her entirely for 7 seasons suddenly discovered urgent reasons to renew her acquaintance. Notes arrived from women who had never previously acknowledged her existence. Lady Grantham wept with uninhibited joy and immediately began planning a wedding breakfast of imperial proportions. Lady Whitmore said nothing publicly, which was, Eleanor suspected, the most she could hope for from that quarter. The first great social test came 3 weeks later at the Beaumont Gala, the most significant event of the winter season, the kind of evening that established hierarchies and settled reputations for years to come. Eleanor dressed carefully in deep garnet silk. Adrian's suggestion, delivered in a note that said you should not always disappear into your surroundings, and arrived on his arm feeling a combination of serenity and sheer terror that she suspected would become the permanent condition of the next several decades of her life. They entered the Beaumont ballroom together, and the room did what it always did when Adrian appeared. Fell briefly silent, recalibrated, resumed. But this time the silence held something different. This time 500 people looked at the woman on his arm and saw her. The actual her. Not the wallflower. Not the blank dance card. Not the invisible woman at the window. They saw the woman the Duke of Ravenscroft had crossed a room to claim, and they adjusted their understanding accordingly. Lady Bancroft approached first, warmly and genuinely, and said that she had always thought Miss Voss remarkably intelligent and she was so very glad that. Eleanor smiled and thanked her and caught Adrian's eye over Lady Bancroft's shoulder, and he gave her a look of such dry, precise amusement that she had to press her lips together to prevent an entirely inappropriate response. Lord Hatfield, who had spoken across Eleanor at 3 separate dinner parties, addressed her directly and at length about her novels, which he had apparently just read, and which he found extraordinary, remarkable, extraordinary. "You said extraordinarily twice," Eleanor observed. "It bears repeating," he said, with the flustered sincerity of a man who has only just realized he missed something important. And then Lady Whitmore appeared. She came with a smile that had been arranged with considerable care, and she offered congratulations in a voice of crystalline graciousness, and Eleanor accepted them with equal graciousness, because she had won and Lady Whitmore knew she had won, and they both understood that this was the moment in which the latter acknowledged the former. "Miss Voss," Lady Whitmore said, "or I suppose I must learn to say your grace." "In time," Eleanor agreed pleasantly. Lady Whitmore's smile held for exactly 2 seconds longer than comfort required, and then she moved away, and that was, Eleanor thought, entirely sufficient. Adrian appeared at her elbow. "Well, your aunt was right about you," Eleanor said. "In what respect?" "She said you always managed to be precisely where you were needed, without being asked." He looked down at her. "I have had considerable practice observing you. You have had considerably less practice at being observed in return." "True." He offered his arm. "Are you going to write about tonight?" "I am absolutely going to write about tonight." "I thought as much. I have decided I do not mind." "You have no choice," she said cheerfully, and took his arm, and they walked back into the light together while the Beaumont Gala arranged itself around them, and 500 people quietly, collectively revised everything they thought they knew about the Duke of Ravenscroft and the woman he had chosen. They married in February, quietly, in the chapel at Ravenscroft Hall, with snow on the ground and Adrian's aunt in the front pew trying unsuccessfully to pretend she was not crying. Eleanor spoke her vows in a clear voice and looked her husband in the eye while she spoke them, and he looked back with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life. Stripped of every armor, wide open, entirely present. Ravenscroft Hall transformed that spring. Not in the physical sense, though Eleanor did eventually rearrange the morning room to allow more light in, and did fill 3 windowsills with plants, and did establish a writing room in the East Tower that Adrian visited regularly on the pretext of delivering tea and remained in for 2 hours discussing her manuscript. It transformed in the way that a house transforms when it stops being a monument to grief and becomes a home again. The staff noticed it first. Lighter footsteps, easier smiles. The way Mrs. Fielding the housekeeper told Eleanor quietly one April morning that she had not heard the Duke laugh in the house since before the late Duchess died, and she had heard it twice last week, and she hoped Miss Voss, your Grace, did not mind her saying so. Eleanor did not mind at all. The night she understood the full depth of it was in late autumn, the 1st November of their marriage. They were in the library. His library, their library. In the armchairs on either side of the fire, the house quiet around them, the moors beyond the windows dark and windswept. He was reading. She was supposedly writing but had in fact spent 40 minutes watching the firelight on his face and composing sentences about it in her head. He looked up and caught her watching. "You are doing it again," he said. "Composing. Studying me. You are very interesting," she said seriously. He set down his book. "Eleanor. Adrian." He looked at her steadily. the way he always did, the way she had learned to love, the quality of his attention, the seriousness with which he met her eyes. "Are you happy?" She thought of 7 seasons. She thought of the blank dance card and the arched windows and the vicar's daughter who had decided that wanting things was a luxury she was not permitted. She thought of the morning 2 weeks ago when he had read the first 3 chapters of her new novel and looked up at her with those gray eyes warm and certain and said, "This is the best thing you have written," with the complete, unperformative sincerity of a man who meant exactly what he said and nothing more and nothing less. She thought of the way he slept, restlessly at first, and now more peacefully, turned toward her, one hand always seeking her. "Adrian," she said softly, "I am so happy that I sometimes wake in the night afraid it is a dream." He was quiet for a moment. Then he crossed the room and sat on the arm of her chair and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they sat like that in the firelight while the autumn wind moved around the walls of Ravenscroft Hall, and it was the most domestic and unremarkable and absolutely perfect thing that had ever happened to either of them. "I should have asked you to dance years ago," he said. "You didn't know me years ago." "No. I should have looked sooner." She tilted her face up toward him. "You looked exactly when you were supposed to." He kissed her temple. "I love you, Eleanor Ashcroft. I love you, Adrian. Even when you lock the doors." "I have not locked them," he said. "In some time." "No," she agreed, settling closer. "You have not." 3 years after the Ashford Winter Ball, they returned to it. They had a daughter by then. Charlotte, 2 years old, left at home with her nurse and the contents of a bookshelf she was already attempting to dismantle. Eleanor was expecting a second child, just beginning to show, which Lady Morrow had declared an excellent development and Lady Whitmore had declined to comment on. Adrian had told Eleanor she was more beautiful than she had ever been, which she had told him was biologically improbable, and he had said he did not care what was probable. The Ashford ballroom was exactly as she remembered it. 500 candles, silk gowns, the practiced magnificence of London society in full, glittering array. Eleanor stood in the entrance and felt a complicated wave of memory move through her. The window, the blank dance card, the loneliness she had dressed up as resignation and told herself was peace. "Are you all right?" Adrian asked quietly, beside her. "I was just thinking about who I was the last time I stood here." And she looked up at him, at the gray eyes she knew now as well as her own, the warmth in them, the steadiness, the absolute and unconditional attention that he had never once, in 3 years, withdrawn. "I was thinking," she said, "that she would not have believed any of this, and I am very glad she was wrong." He took her hand. "She was not wrong about everything," he said. "She was right that the words were worth writing. She was right that honesty mattered more than performance. She was right," he paused. "She was right to stand at the window." "She was waiting," Eleanor said softly. "Yes," he said, "and I was late. Forgive me." She laughed, and the laugh was the one she had discovered in the first weeks of their marriage. Full and genuine, the laugh of a woman who had stopped editing herself. "You are forgiven," she said. "You have been forgiven since you knelt before me in a gallery and told me you found it alarming that I was easy to be honest with." "I was alarmed. You were terrified." Both, she agreed. Around them, the Ashford ball carried on as it always had, glittering and elaborate and entirely convinced of its own importance. But Eleanor stood in it differently now. Not at the window, not invisible, not resigned. She stood in the light in garnet silk, with her husband's hand in hers, and she was seen. He led her to the dance floor when the music began, and they danced as they had 3 years ago, but differently now, the way everything was different when the distance was gone, when you knew the person in your arms the way you knew your own heartbeat. "Next season," she said, "I am bringing Charlotte. She is 2. She will be 3. She should see her first ball." "She should see," he said, "that wallflower corners are places of potential. I intend to tell her so." Eleanor looked up at him. "You are going to be a wonderful father," she said. "You know that." Something moved across his face. Something quiet and profound and entirely unguarded. "I am learning," he said, "from an excellent teacher." The music carried them through the figures of the waltz, and the candles blazed above them, and 500 people moved around them in their silks and their jewels and their practiced, beautiful, terrified social theater. But in the center of it all, the Frost Duke danced with his wife, with the woman who had stood at the window, the woman who had said yes in a portrait gallery, the woman who had walked into his locked rooms and refused to pretend the walls were sufficient, and he held her like she was the only solid thing in the world. Which, he had learned, was exactly what she was. She had spent 7 seasons perfecting the art of invisibility. She had told herself it was wisdom, that wanting nothing was the only sure defense against losing everything. He had spent 4 years building the most formidable walls in England. He had told himself they were necessary, that love was the thing that broke you, and the only safety was in wanting nothing. They were both wrong. The bravest thing either of them ever did was not the grand gesture. Not the Duke crossing a ballroom floor, not the woman holding her ground in Lady Whitmore's drawing room, not the declaration in the library with the winter light streaming through the glass. The bravest thing was smaller than all of that. It was choosing to be honest, choosing to be seen, choosing to stand at the edge of the cliff and decide, against all prior evidence, that the person beside you was worth the fall. That love was not the thing that broke you. That love was the thing that finally, mercifully, made you whole.